At 54, with $214 in her checking account, a cardboard box of lesson plans nobody had asked for, and the deed to a shuttered sewing shop on a dying Main Street in Harlan County, Kentucky, Clara Hensley had nowhere left to go but forward. She had driven 11 hours from Bowling Green in a 2009 Civic with everything she owned distributed between the back seat and the trunk. Clothes, books, a cast-iron skillet, a photograph of Dale taken the summer before he died, and a manila envelope from an attorney's office in Harlan that she had not opened until the rest stop outside London, Kentucky, where she had sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, reading it twice before folding it back along its original creases. The envelope was on the passenger seat now. The car was parked in front of 114 Main Street. The engine was off. It was 7 in the morning, and the October sky was the color of old dishwater, and Clara had not yet opened the door. She looked at the building through the windshield. It was 2 stories of 1940s brick, the mortar gone gray and soft-looking at the corners, a single large front window at street level with a hand-lettered sign that someone had taped inside the glass sometime in 2019. Closed. Thank you for 45 years. The tape had yellowed, and one corner had peeled away so the sign hung slightly crooked. In the window, just visible through the grime and the angle of the morning light, stood a dress form. A woman's form, size 14, with an unfinished navy dress pinned to it, bodice complete, skirt half attached, the raw hem hanging loose. Clara stared at it for a long moment. Someone had left in the middle of something. That happened, she knew. You left in the middle and then you were gone, and the thing stayed exactly where you left it, waiting. She had not known Vera Hensley well. That was the truth she had been carrying since the attorney's letter arrived 6 weeks ago. Vera was her father's older sister, never married, no children that anyone mentioned, a woman who sent Christmas cards with a single line inside. Not a greeting, just an observation, as if she were continuing a conversation that had been paused. The last one had arrived 4 years ago. It said, "The redbuds came early this year." I took that as a good sign. Clara had meant to write back. She had not written back. 4 months ago, Vera had died at 81 in the apartment above her shop, quietly and apparently without drama, and had left the building at 114 Main Street, the shop, the apartment, the contents of both, to Clara Hensley of Bowling Green, Kentucky, who had just lost her teaching position after 26 years and whose husband had been dead for 2, and who had 2 children in other states, who loved her in the way that children love parents when they have their own lives and their own mortgages, and mean well, but cannot fix the particular shape of the silence. Clara picked up the manila envelope from the passenger seat, got out of the car, and stood on the sidewalk. Main Street was 11 storefronts long. 6 of them were dark, plywood or paper in the windows, or simply empty glass looking into empty rooms. Loretta's Hardware was still open, a hand-lettered hour sign in the door, a barber shop, a pharmacy that had reduced its hours to 3 days a week, a single restaurant that appeared to serve breakfast and close by noon. The Dollar General was at the edge of town, which was where the Dollar General always was, and it had taken the rest with it the way those things did. Not maliciously, just by being there and being cheaper and being open on Sundays. She found the key in the envelope. It was old, brass, slightly bent. She put it in the lock. The lock turned on the second try. The smell of the shop came out to meet her. Cold air and dust, machine oil, old fabric, something faintly floral that might have been Vera's hand lotion or might have been memory. Clara wasn't certain which. She pushed the door open and stood in the threshold for a moment before going in. The shop was narrow and longer than it looked from outside. The front half had been the customer space, a low counter with an old mechanical cash register, 2 wooden chairs against the wall, a mirror in a painted frame. Behind the counter, the workbench ran the full width of the room, a long surface of scarred wood with a Singer machine at one end, a lamp with a daylight bulb, a Maxwell House coffee tin holding scissors and seam rippers and chalk markers. 3 bolts of fabric were stacked in the corner, dusty. A wall of narrow cubby shelves held thread. Hundreds of spools, organized by color, running from white through every variation of cream and yellow and gold, and on through the spectrum to black. Someone had spent a great deal of time thinking about thread. Clara walked slowly. Her footsteps were loud in the cold quiet. The dress form stood in the window, and the navy dress caught the morning light, and Clara stopped and looked at it up close. The work that had been done was precise. The bodice seams were clean, the zipper set correctly, the lining attached without puckering. Whoever had commissioned this dress had good taste, and whoever had been making it had known what they were doing. The unfinished hem hung at mid-calf, the fabric raw and straight cut, waiting. Clara touched the edge of it lightly with 2 fingers. She turned and found the stairs behind a curtain at the back of the shop. Vera's apartment was small and would have been dim even in summer. 2 windows facing the alley, a third above the kitchen sink, looking at the brick wall of the building next door. But it was clean in a way that the shop below was not. The surfaces were clear, the dishes washed and stacked, the bed made with a faded quilt in a double wedding ring pattern. A stack of library books on the nightstand with a bookmark in the top one, a crossword puzzle book beside it with a pen clipped to the cover. The pen was uncapped. The puzzle was half finished. Clara stood in the middle of the apartment and understood that Vera had not expected to die. She had been interrupted. She had been, up until the moment she stopped, entirely in the middle of her life. Reading, puzzling, keeping the apartment tidy, running the shop below in the particular private way she had apparently run it for 45 years. The life had simply stopped and left everything where it was. The apartment felt less like a place a person had died and more like a place a person had just stepped away from. She went back downstairs. The tomato pincushion was on the workbench just to the left of the Singer machine. Clara had not noticed it on the way through. It was the size of a tennis ball, red velvet, plump with stuffing, with a small strawberry-shaped emery hanging from it on a cord. There were a dozen pins stuck into it at different angles, as if Vera had set it down mid-project. Clara picked it up and held it in both hands. It was heavier than she expected. The velvet was worn smooth in the places where Vera's palm had rested against it, over and over. 45 years of reaching for it and setting it down. Clara stood at the workbench holding the pincushion and did not cry, which surprised her a little. She had been braced for it, but what she felt was quieter than grief. Something more like recognition, like arriving somewhere she had not known she was heading. The knock at the glass came at 8:15. The woman outside was in her early 70s, broad-shadowed, wearing a canvas coat and carrying a thermos and a dish covered in foil. She had the look of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out. Clara unlocked the door. The woman said, "I'm Loretta Vance. I run the hardware next door. I've been running it for 40 years, so I'll probably be here longer than you expect." She held out the thermos. "Coffee and cornbread. I didn't know if you'd have anything." Clara had not eaten since the rest stop outside London. She stepped back and let Loretta in. They sat on overturned plastic crates near the workbench, and Loretta poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to Clara and talked about Vera the way people talk about someone they respected and were still in the process of understanding. Vera had been precise, Loretta said. Not cold, precise. There was a difference. She had opinions about thread weight and seam allowance, and she had never once been wrong about either. She had kept the shop open when there was no reason to keep it open, and closed it when she was ready, and not a day before. She had attended the First Baptist Church for 60 years, and always sat in the last pew and left during the final hymn, so she did not have to shake hands. She had never explained herself. Did she have friends? Clara asked. Loretta considered this. She had people, she said finally. People she knew and people who knew her. Whether that's the same as friends, I couldn't say. She broke off a piece of cornbread and set it on the foil for Clara. She never once let a person leave that shop feeling like they'd been helped. That was her gift. You walked out thinking you'd done her a favor by bringing your hem to her. Clara looked at the Maxwell House tin on the workbench. "Why me?" she said. "I barely knew her. I should have known her better, and I didn't." Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know. But Vera didn't do things without a reason. She just didn't always explain the reason. She said it in a way that was not entirely the full truth," Clara thought. But she did not push. Loretta left at 9:30. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her unlock the hardware store next door, flip the sign, go in. She spent the rest of the day making a list. That night, she slept in Vera's bed under the double wedding ring quilt and woke twice and lay still in the dark, listening to the sounds of a town with very few people left in it. The third time she woke, it was 2 in the morning and she was not going back to sleep. She got up and went to the kitchen. She found the note inside the cabinet above the percolator, small, folded once, written on the back of a receipt in handwriting that was economical and slightly slanted. "The coffee stays on. V." Clara looked at the note for a long time. Then she filled the percolator, set it on the burner, turned the burner on, and stood at the kitchen window watching the one working streetlight on Main Street while she waited for it to brew. She picked up her phone and looked at the screen for a moment, then set it face down on the counter. Tomorrow. Tonight, she just stood in Vera's kitchen and drank Vera's coffee and listened to the town be quiet. 3 days in, Clara had a system. She started at 7 each morning with the percolator on, and Vera's note propped against the Maxwell House tin where she could see it. She worked from front to back, top to bottom, making inventory in the notebook she had found in Vera's desk drawer. Spiral-bound, college-ruled, still half blank. She used her own red pen. Old habit, the front counter first. The cash register was a 1960s mechanical National, the kind with individual keys that depressed with a satisfying click and a drawer that flew open with a bell. She cataloged the contents of the drawer: rubber bands, a book of receipt slips, 2 pennies, a folded note in Vera's handwriting that said Dottie Maynard, left sleeve 1 inch, right sleeve 3/4. Do not let her argue about the difference. Clara smiled at that and put it back. The thread wall took 2 hours to properly count. 412 spools in total, organized not just by color, but by weight within each color, so that the blues ran from a single strand of pale ice through every depth of navy to a near black midnight, and within each shade the thinner threads occupied the upper shelves and the heavier ones the lower. This was the work of someone who had thought carefully about order and had maintained it across decades. Clara recorded every spool. The Singer machine she left for last each day. The way you save the thing you most want to look at. It was a 1961 model, tan and cream. The needle still threaded with dark gray thread from whatever Vera's last project had been. Clara sat down at it on the second day and ran a length of scrap fabric through it, and it sewed a seam so clean. And even that she sat back and looked at it the way you look at something that has been doing its job perfectly for 60 years without anyone watching. She moved the workbench on the morning of the 4th day. She needed to sweep beneath it. She shifted the bench out from the wall in sections, heavy work, and swept in long strokes. And it was on the last stroke near the baseboard that the broom handle knocked against something that sounded different. She stopped. She knocked again, gently, with the heel of her palm. The floor sounded hollow. Not the general hollowness of old flooring, but something specific. A resonance suggesting empty space below wood. She crouched down. The boards here were older than the rest of the floor, slightly darker, and when she looked closely she could see it. A seam, straight and deliberate, forming a rectangle approximately 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. Not a crack. A seam that had been cut and fitted and set flush with the surrounding board so that you would not notice it unless you were already on your knees. Clara went to the Maxwell House tin and found a flathead screwdriver. She worked the blade into the seam at the near edge, gently, feeling for give. The wood resisted, then shifted, the whole panel moving slightly, a 1/4 inch, enough to confirm it was not nailed. She worked her fingers into the gap and lifted. The panel came up in one piece, a fitted rectangle of floorboard with a small brass pull, recessed into its underside, smooth from handling. Below was a space, roughly the depth of a shoebox, set into the subfloor between the joists. Clara reached her phone down and turned on the flashlight. A wooden box, dark with age, sealed with a small brass latch. She lifted it out carefully, the way you lift something that has been waiting. It was heavier than it looked. She carried it to the workbench and set it under the daylight lamp and stood looking at it for a moment before she opened the latch. Inside, wrapped in a piece of navy wool, were 3 things. The first was a ledger, cloth-covered, dark green, the fabric worn soft at the corners. The spine had been reinforced with electrical tape at some point, carefully, without covering the original material. The second was a rubber-banded stack of receipts, each one marked at the top in Vera's handwriting. Paid. No charge. There were perhaps 200 of them banded in groups, each band labeled by decade. The third was an envelope, letter-sized, sealed. On the front, in Vera's handwriting, economical, slightly slanted, was a single name. Clara. She looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she set it aside and opened the ledger. The first entry was dated September 4th, 1974. The handwriting was the same throughout. It did not change the way handwriting changes over decades, did not become looser or more labored. It stayed precise, vertical. The letters formed with the same economy as the note above the percolator, as if Vera had decided early what her handwriting would look like and had simply maintained it. September 4th, 1974. First week open. Agnes Purvis brought in her husband's work trousers, 3 pairs, needed the knees patched. Fabric worn through on all of them, charged for thread and time. She counted out exact change, $7.50, and thanked me 3 times. She has 4 children. The trousers will need to come back in 6 months. I will charge her less. Clara read it twice. Then she turned the page. The entries were not daily. Some weeks had 4, some had none. But they accumulated. Names and dates and small specific needs, each one recorded with the same plainness, the same attention to detail. November 22nd, 1974. Told Hattie Combs her coat lining was too far gone to repair. Replaced the whole lining. Charged her for the old one. She doesn't know. March 8th, 1975. Tom Hendricks came in about his suit. Wedding anniversary. Wants to take Marla out to Hazard. Suit hasn't fit since 1968. Let it out 2 inches through the chest and waist. Replaced the pocket lining that had gone to nothing. Told him it was $7. It was more than $7 work, but he's been at the mine, and the mine has not been kind this winter. June 3rd, 1979. Robert Caulfield, christening dress for infant son. Family short this month. No charge. The dress was simple, but I lined the sleeves so the baby wouldn't scratch. The names went on. Families whose names she recognized from Loretta's stories, names she had seen on the storefronts that still had them. Miners and teachers, and the woman who ran the diner, and the man who repaired the church organ, and a young woman named Dina Cole, who had needed a winter coat taken in, because she had lost weight in a way that the entry noted, quietly, suggested something harder than dieting. Children's clothes altered as children grew. Formal wear for funerals and graduations and court appearances. A wedding dress remade 3 times as the wedding date moved, and the bride's circumstances changed. Clara read for 2 hours without moving from the workbench stool. She had been a teacher for 26 years, and she had believed, on most of the days, that the work mattered, that the student sitting in front of her took something forward that they would not have had otherwise. But the evidence of it was always indirect, always delayed, always a matter of faith. You taught and you hoped, and sometimes, years later, a former student stopped you in a parking lot and said something that made you feel the faith had been warranted. But you never saw the full accounting. You never knew for certain. Vera's ledger was an accounting. 45 years of it. Every name, every amount, every small specific reason. Not charity, but something closer to attention. The record of a woman who had noticed what people needed and had found ways to address it without making them feel addressed. She never once let a person leave that shop feeling like they'd been helped. And here, below the floorboards, was the evidence that it had been a gift given consistently, without exception, for nearly half a century. Clara turned the pages slowly. She was somewhere in the late 1980s reading an entry about a family named Morse, whose youngest daughter had needed a flower girl dress on 6 days' notice and no budget, when she turned a page and saw her own name. She stopped. October 14th, 2013. Clara Hensley called the shop today asking if I had work for a girl who could sew. She said it casual, like she was calling about something ordinary. I don't think she needed the work. She's teaching over in Bowling Green and her husband has a job. I think she was checking on me. I told her I was fine and I had all the help I needed, which was true. I am fine. I have always been fine. I think she knows that. I hope she knows I know she called. Clara read it twice, then a third time. She had been 37 years old in 2013. Dale had been alive. She had called because something had made her think of Vera, some article about Harlan County in the newspaper, and she had picked up the phone without quite deciding to. She had forgotten about the call entirely within a week. Vera had written it down. Clara set the ledger on the workbench. She picked up the tomato pincushion and held it in both hands, the velvet worn smooth in Vera's palm places, the small strawberry emery swinging gently from its cord. The sealed envelope with her name on it sat 6 inches away. She looked at it for a long time. The percolator was on upscale. The street light outside was coming on in the early dark, the October evening arriving faster than she'd expected. She could hear, very faintly, Loretta locking up the hardware store next door. She put her hand on the envelope. Then she took her hand away. Not yet. Only that it felt like the kind of thing you needed to be ready for, and she was not ready yet. She put the envelope back in the wooden box. She closed the latch. She left the ledger open on the workbench under the daylight lamp. She went upstairs and poured coffee and stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking at the street below, before she called her daughter, and this time let it ring. Clara made her decision on a Monday morning in the first week of November, standing at the workbench with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. It was not a dramatic decision. It did not feel like a turning point the way turning points felt in the books she had taught. No clarity arriving like weather, no sudden knowledge of what she was supposed to do. It felt more like the moment when you have been looking at a problem on the board long enough that the answer simply becomes visible. Not because anything changed, but because you have been patient. She was going to open the shop. She did not know how to run a business. She knew how to sew, and she knew how to show up, and she had learned, across 26 years in a classroom, that those 2 things were more than most people gave them credit for. She wrote the list in the order the problems presented themselves. Electrical. The overhead fixtures in the back half of the shop were dead. 2 outlets near the workbench sparked when she tested them, and the heating unit was wired into a panel that Loretta's husband had installed in 1987 and which had not been inspected since. Heat was not optional. November in Harlan County was not a month that negotiated. The front window needed its seal replaced. She could feel the cold coming through the frame on windy mornings, a thin, persistent draft that moved the hem of the unfinished navy dress on the dress form and made the shop feel more abandoned than it was. The back storage room was floor to ceiling with 45 years of accumulated material. She needed to know what she had before she could know what she needed. She looked at the list. Then she added a fourth item, which was the hardest one. Tell someone what you're doing. The next morning she walked to Loretta's hardware when it opened and asked if she could put a card in the window. Loretta said of course and handed her an index card and a marker. Clara wrote, "Needle and thread reopening. Looking for someone who knows electrical and general repair. Room offered in exchange for work." She wrote the shop's number below it. The landline still worked, the number unchanged from the one printed on Vera's old receipts. Loretta read the card before she taped it up. She said, "You know Boyd Satterfield has been wanting to do something since Vera passed. He won't ask. But if you need lumber or general labor, he would come." Clara said she would keep that in mind. She walked back to the shop and uncovered the two machines in the storage room. The first was a 1970s Sarger, functional but needing a new blade. The second was a long-arm quilting machine, older, heavy, bolted to a frame that took up most of the room's east wall. She stood looking at it for a long time. Vera had never advertised quilting services. She had simply had the machine, and used it, for reasons she had kept to herself. The phone rang at 7:15 the next morning. The voice on the other end was young, male, unhurried. He said his name was James Cole, and he had seen the card in the hardware store window. He had some electrical experience in general repair, and he was currently in the county and available. His truck had broken down on Route 119 2 days ago and was at the garage waiting on a part that wouldn't arrive until the end of the week. He had time. Clara said, "What kind of electrical experience?" He said, "Commercial and residential. I'm not currently licensed in Kentucky, but the work is solid. I can show you what I've done." Clara said, "The room upstairs is small. There's a cot and a bathroom and a kitchen with a percolator." He said, "That's fine." She said, "I don't ask questions about where people have been." A pause, then, "That's fine too." She said, "Come at 8. He arrived at 8 exactly, which told her something. He was younger than she had expected. 28, she would learn later, though he carried himself without the restlessness that men his age often carried. Medium height, work-worn hands, a canvas jacket that had been repaired at the left elbow with a patch that did not match but had been sewn with care. He looked at the shop the way tradespeople look at things they are about to fix, systematically, without sentiment, starting at the ceiling and working down. He said, "The panel's in the back?" She said it was. He went and looked at it for 5 minutes without touching anything, then came back and told her what needed to happen. The wiring from the panel to the back fixtures had been done in aluminum in the 1970s and needed to be replaced with copper. 2 of the outlets near the workbench had loose connections that were a fire risk, and the heating unit's wiring was undersized for the load it was drawing. He said he could do all of it. He said it would take 4 or 5 days, depending on what he found in the walls. Clara said, "The room is yours while you're working." He nodded and went back to the panel. By the end of the first day, he had the heating unit running correctly and one of the bad outlets replaced. He worked without music, which Clara appreciated. He stopped at noon for exactly 15 minutes, sat on the front step with a sandwich he had brought himself, and resumed. She brought coffee out at 3 without announcing it and set it on the step beside him and went back in. He did not comment. She took it as acceptance. By the end of the 3rd day, he had replaced the aluminum runs in the back half of the shop, and the overhead fixtures were on. Warm light filling the storage room for what felt like the first time in years. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at the long-arm quilting machine properly illuminated, and said, I had no idea that was there. Picture. He had told her by then to call him Picture. Looked at the machine with the same systematic appraisal he gave everything. He said, somebody knew what they were doing when they installed it. The frame's still level. That was the most he had said at once since arriving. Clara took it as high praise. On the fourth day he found the east wall. He had been tracing a run of wiring behind the paneling and had pulled a section of the baseboard trim when he stopped and called to Clara. She came and looked where he was pointing. Behind the trim, someone had packed the wall cavity with insulation, newer than the walls, installed carefully, and when Picture pressed against the paneling above it, the panel flexed slightly. He found the seam along the top and worked his hand into it. What came out of the wall was a wire. Specifically, a run of 14-gauge copper wire, coiled and capped, extending from the panel into the wall cavity. A dedicated circuit, properly installed, running to nowhere visible. Picture traced it with his eyes and then with his hands and said, "This runs to the front window frame." Clara went and looked at the window frame. There, fitted into the inner edge of the frame behind the trim, was a junction box. From the junction box ran 2 leads capped and waiting, exactly positioned to power a sign that had not been installed. A sign that Vera had wired for and never put up. Clara stood at the window, looking out at Main Street, at the 6 dark storefronts and the 1 working street light and the bare trees at the end of the block. She thought about a woman who had run a shop for 45 years and kept a ledger under the floorboards and wired the window frame for a sign she never hung. She thought, Vera was planning to stay open. She thought Vera was planning something. Picture was watching her from the back of the room. He said nothing. He was good at that. Clara said, "Can you wire a sign to that?" He said, "What kind of sign?" She said, "I don't know yet." "But a lit one." He said, "Yes." If you've made it this far into Clara's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The following Wednesday, Dennis Caulfield's Escalade pulled up in front of the shop at 11 in the morning, clean despite the county roads, the black paint catching the flat November light. Clara saw it from the workbench where she was going through the rubber-banded receipts. She watched the man get out. He was in his mid-40s, well-dressed without being overdressed, the particular clothing of someone who has money and does not need to announce it. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the building, and then he looked at the dress form in the window and seemed briefly caught off guard by the unfinished navy dress. And Clara watched his expression shift in a way that was difficult to read from across the room. He came in. He was pleasant. He was, Clara thought, probably genuinely pleasant. This was not performance. He said the building had good bones and that he had been following the county's development plans and thought the block had real potential, the kind of potential the state tourism office was beginning to take seriously. He used the word honestly before the sentence about the offer price, which was $140,000, and before the sentence about the timeline being flexible. He said he understood this was her family's building and that these things were complicated, and he wanted to be respectful of that. Clara had been listening to people say things they half meant for 26 years. She looked past him at the dress form in the window. She said, "I'm sure the block could be something again." He waited for more. There wasn't more. He took out his card and set it on the counter. It was a heavy card, cream-colored, with his name embossed. He said to take her time. He said he would follow up. He glanced around the shop once more on his way to the door. At the thread wall, at the Singer machine, at Picture's tools laid out neatly along the baseboard. And then he was gone. Clara picked up his card and looked at it. Then she put it in her notebook. That evening, she was reading more of the ledger when she heard the truck outside. Boyd Satterfield was in the bed of his pickup unloading lumber by himself in the dark, stacking it carefully against the side wall of the building without making more noise than he had to. Clara put her coat on and went out. Boyd was 66, thick through the chest. the kind of man who had spent his life doing physical work and would keep doing it past the point where his body recommended otherwise. He did not stop unloading when she came out. He said, "I heard you were fixing the place up. Vera hemmed my daughter's wedding dress in 2003. Wouldn't take more than $12 for it. I told her it was worth $40, and she said she had set her price and wasn't interested in negotiating." Clara said, "You don't have to do this." Boyd said, "I know I don't." He stacked the last board and straightened up. "I've been meaning to do something about it for 22 years. Loretta said you were here and fixing the place up." He looked at the building. Vera would have liked to see the lights on in the back. He got back in his truck and drove away before Clara could say anything else worth saying. She stood on the sidewalk in the November dark for a moment. Then she went inside and turned the back lights on. The new ones Picture had installed, warm and steady through the shop windows. She left them on all night. November settled into Harlan County the way it always did. Not dramatically, not with a single hard frost that announced itself, but incrementally. The temperature dropping a few degrees every few days until one morning Clara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and realized she could no longer see the ridge to the east because the clouds had come down to meet it, and the bare trees along the street had stopped looking stark and started looking permanent. She had developed a schedule without deciding to. 7 o'clock. Percolator on. Coffee. The first hour at the workbench going through Vera's receipts and cross-referencing names with the ledger, building in her notebook a kind of index, who had come in, how often, what they had needed, what Vera had charged, versus what the work had actually been worth. The gap between those two numbers, accumulated across 412 receipts spanning 45 years, was a figure Clara had not yet added up because she suspected it would be very large, and she was not sure what to do with a very large number when the person who had generated it was dead. 8 o'clock, downstairs to work. The storage room was revealing itself in layers. Behind the bolts of fabric were boxes of findings, the industry word for buttons and hooks and zippers and interfacing and all the small components that made garments possible. Vera had been a systematic purchaser. She had bought in quantity when the price was right and stored carefully and dated everything. Clara found findings from the 1980s, still in their original packaging, still perfectly usable, organized in shallow drawers by type and size. She found a box of zippers in every weight from featherlight to heavy duty that alone would have cost several $100s at current prices. She found, in the back corner under a canvas tarp, 6 bolts of fabric that she unrolled carefully and identified as wool coating, charcoal, camel, a deep teal, of a quality that made her spread the teal across the workbench and just look at it for a while. The afternoons she gave to sewing. This had not been on her original list. It had simply started. She had sat down at the Singer one afternoon to test a tension adjustment and had not gotten up for 2 hours. She was working through Vera's unfinished items first, the basket of alterations from 2018 and 2019 that had never been picked up. She finished them anyway. She did not know what she would do with them. She finished them because Vera had started them, and it seemed wrong to leave them undone. The navy dress on the form she was saving. Picture noticed her working one afternoon and watched for a moment from the storage room doorway. He said, "You're good at that." Clara said, "I'm adequate." Vera was good. He considered this distinction. Then he went back to work. She was running a flat-felled seam on a man's suit jacket when she heard the car outside. She looked up. A sensible sedan, and the woman who got out of it was in her mid-40s, still in hospital scrubs under her coat, moving with the careful efficiency of someone who had been awake for more hours than recommended. She came to the door and knocked, and when Clara opened it, she held out a ceramic dish covered in foil. She said, "I'm Angie Morse. My mother is Donna Morse. Vera did her wedding dress alterations in 1979. I do the night shift at the hospital in Hazard, and I heard you were fixing the place up. This is chicken and rice." It reheats well. Clara took the dish. She said, "Do you want to come in?" Angie Morse looked past her at the shop, and something in her expression shifted in a way that Clara recognized. The expression of someone seeing a thing they had been half expecting for a long time. She said, "I have to get home and sleep. But I'm glad you're here." She turned to go, then stopped. "My mother's in the ledger. I don't know if you found it yet. But she is." She said it simply, and then she got in the car and drove away. Clara stood in the doorway holding the casserole. 20 minutes later, a truck she had not seen before pulled up slowly, stopped. A young man, 19, 20, got out and walked to the door carrying 2 paper grocery bags. He set them on the step without knocking. He looked up and saw Clara through the glass and raised one hand in a half wave, not quite a wave, more an acknowledgement, and then got back in the truck and it drove away. She picked up the bags: bread, soup cans, apples, coffee, a bag of sugar, a pound of butter. She stood on the sidewalk in the November cold holding the groceries and looked up and down Main Street. Loretta was in the hardware window, watching. When Clara looked at her, Loretta turned away and went back to work. Clara went inside. She told Picture about the casserole at noon the next day. He ate a portion without comment. Then he said, "Word travels," Clara said, apparently without wires. He almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen. She was in the storage room that afternoon when she found the record books. At the bottom of the box, under the business records, was a manila folder containing property documents she did not immediately understand. A survey map, correspondence with the county assessor's office. She sat down on a bolt of fabric and read through them. The correspondence was from 1987. Vera had reclassified the building's commercial designation, and there was a letter from the county confirming the reclassification. But the confirmation letter referenced a filing number that did not match the application number on Vera's copy of the submission. A clerical error, small, probably meaningless, probably. Clara read the correspondence twice. She put it in her notebook with a red pen mark in the margin. She did not mention it to Picture. That evening, Dennis Caulfield's attorney called the shop's landline. He was polite, precise, the kind of attorney who had been trained to sound like he was doing you a favor while doing the opposite. He said there was a question about the building's commercial classification, a discrepancy in the 1987 county records, and that while it was almost certainly resolvable, it was something Clara might want to address before proceeding with any significant investment in the property. He said the county assessor's office had been made aware of the question. He said Dennis was still very interested in the property and that the offer remained open. Clara thanked him for the call. She hung up and sat at the workbench for a while. The ledger was open beside her at the 1987 entries. She read them slowly. Dina Cole, winter coat and school clothes for a child named James, $50. The Morse wedding alterations. A family named Prater whose daughter had needed a baptism gown. The ordinary specific record of an ordinary specific year. She picked up the phone and called Loretta. She said, "Do you know a property attorney? Someone local, or close to local?" Loretta said, "Walt Greer, over in Hazard. He's 70 and he doesn't advertise, but he's sharp as he ever was. Vera altered his wife's coat every winter for 15 years and never raised her price." "He'll take her call," Clara said. "He'll take my call." Loretta was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, that's what I meant." Clara wrote the name in her notebook. She placed both hands flat on the workbench, feeling the scarred wood under her palms. The history of the surface, the nicks and stains and shallow grooves from 45 years of work done here. She looked at the thread wall. She looked at the Singer machine. She looked at the dress form in the window with the unfinished navy dress, the hem still hanging, waiting. Then she looked at the wooden box on the shelf above the workbench. the sealed envelope inside it with her name on it in Vera's handwriting. She was not ready yet, but she was closer. She stood up, turned off the daylight lamp, and went upstairs. The percolator was on. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and thought about a clerical error from 1987 and a man who used the word honestly before the sentences that mattered most, and a ledger full of names that the county assessor's office did not know existed. She thought, Vera kept records. So will I. She went to her notebook and wrote Walt Greer's name at the top of a fresh page. Below it, she wrote the filing number from Vera's correspondence and the number from the county's confirmation letter, side by side, so the discrepancy was visible at a glance. Then she wrote, in the careful block letters she had used on the board for 26 years when she wanted students to pay attention. The error is theirs. Find the proof. She underlined it once. Walt Greer drove over from Hazard on a Thursday morning in a 12-year-old Buick that had been maintained with the same precision he apparently applied to everything else. He was 70 years old, thin, with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to waste energy on anything that did not require it. He wore a sport coat and carried a leather briefcase that Clara suspected was older than she was. He shook her hand at the door and looked around the shop once, briefly, and then sat down at the workbench stool and opened his briefcase. She put Vera's correspondence in front of him, the application number and the confirmation number side by side. Walt put on his reading glasses and looked at the documents for 4 minutes without speaking. Clara poured coffee and set a cup beside him and did not interrupt. Walt said, "The error is the county's." Clara said, "That's what I thought." He said, "The application is correctly filed and dated. The confirmation letter references the wrong internal number. A transposition, 2 digits reversed. It's a clerical error on the county's side, documented in their own correspondence. Your ownership and classification are not in question." He took off his reading glasses. "Whoever told you they were was either mistaken or hoping you wouldn't check." Clara said, "The second one." Walt almost smiled. He said, "I'll write a letter to the assessor's office. The matter will close within a week. They will not enjoy the conversation, but they will not argue with their own documentation." He paused. "I don't charge for letters. Vera altered my wife's coat every November for 15 years and never once let me pay what it was worth. Consider this a very long overdue accounting." Clara said, "I'm starting to understand how she operated." Walt said, "It takes a while." He finished his coffee, repacked his briefcase, and stood. He looked at the thread wall for a moment, then at the dress form in the window. He said, "Eleanor, my wife, she used to say that Vera understood what things were actually worth, as opposed to what people were willing to pay. She said it like it was a rare quality." He picked up his briefcase. He said, "It is." He drove back to Hazard. The letter went to the county assessor's office the following Monday. By Wednesday, the assessor's office had confirmed in writing that the classification was valid and the 1987 filing was recorded correctly. Clara put the confirmation in her notebook behind the red-penned page and drew a single line through "The error is theirs. Find the proof." The matter was closed. Dennis Caulfield came back on a Friday, alone. No Escalade this time. A plain gray truck, the kind that did not stand out on county roads. He parked it on the street and came to the door and knocked, which he had not done before. Clara opened it. He said, "Do you have a few minutes?" She gestured to the workbench stool. He sat. He was different without his attorney, less composed, not in a way that suggested weakness, but in a way that suggested he had decided to set something down. He said the development project was real, and he wanted her to know that. It was not pretense. He believed the county could draw people back with the right investment, and he had been working on it for 2 years. He also wanted her to know that the assessor matter had been his attorney's idea, and he had not been certain it was the right approach. Clara said, "Was that an apology?" He thought about it. He said, Yes. She poured coffee and set a cup in front of him without asking. He accepted it. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of the shop. Clara said, "What do you actually want for the county?" Not the development language, the actual thing. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "People back. Businesses that last more than a season. Something that makes the people who stayed feel like they were right to stay." He said it simply, without the architecture of his previous visits, and Clara thought it was probably the most honest thing he had said since walking through her door. She said, "Then we probably want the same thing." He looked at her. He said, "I suppose we might." He finished his coffee and set the cup on the workbench and stood, and it was at that moment that picture appeared in the storage room doorway. He said, "Clara." His voice was level, but there was something in it she had not heard before, a careful quality, the tone of someone carrying something fragile. He was holding a small ledger, thinner than the green one, bound in brown cloth. He said, "I found this in the back of the last box. Different dates. I think you should see something." Clara crossed the room. Picture set the ledger open on the workbench, his finger marking a page. The entries here were in the same hand as the green ledger, but the writing was slightly smaller, more compressed. Clara read the entry his finger indicated. June 3rd, 1979. Robert Caulfield, christening dress for infant son. Family short this month. No charge. The dress was simple, but I lined the sleeves so the baby wouldn't scratch. She looked up. Dennis was still standing at the workbench stool, his truck keys in his hand. She carried the ledger to him and set it open on the counter without explanation. He looked down at it. He read the entry. His expression did not change immediately. It changed the way landscapes change when the light shifts, slowly, the same features becoming different. He read it a second time. Then he was still for a while, and Clara let the silence do its work. He said, "I didn't know that." His voice was even. "My father didn't talk about those years much. I knew we didn't have money when I was small, but I didn't know." He stopped. He looked at the entry again. "Family short this month. No charge." He said, "I was 4 months old." Clara said, "Most people didn't know." That was how she wanted it. He set the ledger back on the counter carefully. He stood looking at it for another moment. Then he said, "She lined the sleeves." Clara said, "She did." He picked up his keys. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at the shop, at the thread wall, at the singer, at the dress form in the window. And his expression was the expression of a man revising something. He said, "I'll be in touch." He said it differently than he had said it before. He went out to his truck and drove away. Picture went back to the storage room. Clara stood at the workbench with the brown ledger open in front of her. She turned the pages slowly, and it was 20 minutes later, somewhere in the middle of the 1987 section, that she found it. November 4th, 1987. Dina Cole, coat taken in, 2 sizes. Also school clothes for her boy James, age 8. Coat and clothes together, $50 paid. The boy needs boots too, but she couldn't stretch to it this visit. I put a note in the pocket of the coat for her to come back when she can. Clara looked toward the storage room. She carried the ledger to the doorway. Picture was on his back under the long arm frame, checking the tension mechanism, his work light clipped to the frame above him. She waited until he slid out. She held the ledger open to the 1987 entry and did not say anything. He took the ledger and read it. He read it standing up, the work light behind him casting the room in warm yellow. His face was the same as always, contained, private. He read the entry once, and then once more, and then he handed the ledger back to Clara. He said, "My mother never talked about how we got through that winter." Clara said, "Vera wrote that she hoped the coat fit right." He nodded. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he said, "Did she say anything else about it?" Clara checked the entry again. She said she put a note in the pocket about coming back for boots. Picture was quiet. Then he said, "I had those boots by Christmas." He said it the way you say a thing you have held for a long time without knowing what it meant. And now it means something. He looked at the entry one more time. Then he said, "I'll finish the tension check, and then I want to look at that window frame again. I think we should order the sign material this week." He went back under the frame. Clara stood in the doorway holding the brown ledger, listening to the small sounds of him working, the careful, steady sounds of someone doing a thing they knew how to do. She went to the workbench and sat down and opened her notebook and wrote Picture's mother's name. She wrote the date and the amount and coat, 2 sizes, school clothes, note in pocket, boots by Christmas. She underlined the last part. She was closing the notebook when the bell above the shop door rang. The woman in the doorway was in her early 30s, broad-shouldered, with Picture's eyes and a directness in her expression that was immediately familiar. She looked at the shop the way Picture had looked at it on the first morning, starting at the ceiling, working down. She looked at Clara. She looked through the storage room door at her brother's legs extending from under the quilting frame. She said, "I'm Dina Cole's daughter. James called and said he'd found somewhere worth staying." She looked around the shop again, at the thread wall and the singer and the dress form in the window. She said, "I can see why." Clara said, "There's more work than 2 people can finish." Dana said, "I have a week." Clara said, "You can have the couch in the apartment. The percolator's always on." Dina shrugged off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, the hook Vera had put there in 1974, the first week the shop was open, and went to the storage room door and looked in at her brother and said, "You look ridiculous under there." Picture said without coming out. The tension was off by a quarter turn. Dina said, "Obviously." She stayed 3 weeks. Clara opened the letter on a Sunday morning in the last week of November. She sat at Vera's workbench with her coffee and the wooden box open in front of her. Picture and Dina had gone to get breakfast at the diner on Main Street, a Sunday habit that had established itself without announcement, a small separate thing that Clara did not join and was not meant to join. She lifted out the envelope, her name on the front in Vera's handwriting. The envelope had been sealed with care, the flap pressed down evenly. Clara held it for a moment, the way she had held the tomato pincushion on the first morning, feeling the weight of it. Then she opened it. The letter was 2 pages, written on plain white paper, in the same hand as the ledger. No date at the top. Clara understood, reading the first lines, that Vera had written it some time ago and had revised it. There were places where a word had been crossed out once and replaced, the kind of revision that comes from saying a thing and then saying it more accurately. "Clara, I expect you are wondering why I left you this building and not someone who knew me better, or someone who needed it more obviously. I have thought about how to explain it, and the best I can do is this. I have been watching you for a long time, from a distance, the way you watch someone when you don't want them to know you're paying attention. I watched you marry Dale, and I watched you teach at that school for more years than they deserve to keep you, and I watched you lose Dale and keep going, which is not a small thing, even when it looks like a small thing from the outside. I know about the school closing. I know about the job. I know the shape of the situation you are in. And I want you to understand that I did not leave you this building because I felt sorry for you. I am not a person who does things out of sorrow. I left it to you because the building needs a person who knows how to show up when showing up is inconvenient, and you have been doing that your whole life without anyone particularly noticing. The shop is not a gift. I want to be clear about that. It is a post. Someone has to tend it. I tended it for 45 years, and I was the right person for 45 years, and then I got old and tired, and I could see that the right person was going to be someone else eventually. I spent some time being annoyed about this, which is my nature, and then I made my peace with it and put your name in the documents. You will find the ledger. I imagine you already have if you are reading this. I kept it because I needed to keep it. Not to be remembered. I have no particular interest in being remembered. But because the names deserve to be written down somewhere. People came to me with things they needed, and I helped when I could, and I didn't make a thing of it because making a thing of it would have ruined it. The ledger is for me, but now I suppose it is for you. There is a panel in the window frame, the inside edge of the front window, behind the trim on the right side. I ran a circuit to it in 2017 because I was going to put up a proper sign that winter, and then I didn't because I got busy, and then I got tired, and then I stopped making plans that required winter to pass first. The circuit is there. Put up a sign. One more thing. There is a half-finished dress on the form in the window. Navy blue. Woman's size 14. Her name is Patsy Dill, and her number is in the receipt book under D. She paid a deposit in 2019, and I closed before I could finish it. Finish it. Charge her what I quoted, which is on the receipt. Don't charge her more. The coffee stays on. The door stays open. That is all I ever figured out how to do. It turns out it was enough. Vera Clara read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and held the envelope in both hands for a moment, looking at the thread wall, at the 412 spools of thread organized by color and weight, the pale ice at one end, running through every variation to the near black midnight at the other. She set the envelope in the wooden box. She put the tomato pincushion on top of it. She sat at the workbench for a while longer, drinking her coffee in the Sunday quiet, and did not cry, and did not feel she needed to. Then she got up and found Patsy Dill's number in the receipt book. The shop opened on the second Monday of March, 6 weeks before the redbuds came. Not a grand opening. Clara had not advertised it as such, had not put an announcement in the paper, or made a sign for the window beyond the one picture had wired and installed the week prior, which said, Vera's Needle and Thread in the same hand-lettered style as the old sign, lit from within, warm white against the March gray. She had simply unlocked the door at 8 o'clock and turned the sign on and put the percolator on and sat down at the workbench. The first customer came at 8:40, a man she did not recognize who needed a zipper replaced in a winter coat. She replaced it while he waited, sitting in one of the wooden chairs she had refinished in January, and charged him what the work was worth, and he paid without discussion and left with the coat over his arm. Clara wrote the date and the job and the amount in her notebook with her red pen. By the third week there were regulars. Not many. The town did not have many to spare. But enough. Loretta came over for coffee at 11 on Wednesdays and Fridays, a habit that had established itself without announcement. Boyd Satterfield came in twice with work shirts that needed the collars turned, a repair that extended a shirt's life by years, and Clara charged him for thread in 20 minutes of time, and he paid and argued with the amount, and she told him she had set her price and was not interested in negotiating. Boyd laughed, the first time she had heard him laugh, and she thought, there it is. There is how it worked. Picture had stayed. He had not said he was staying. He had simply not left. The truck repaired and parked behind the shop. His work light moved to the small workbench he had built along the back wall. He was doing electrical repair now, small jobs, appliances, wiring questions, the occasional panel assessment for someone Loretta had sent over. He had applied for his Kentucky license. He did not talk about the timeline. Clara did not ask. Dina had gone back to Paintsville after her 3 weeks, but she called on Sundays. And in April, she came back for a long weekend and brought 2 friends who wanted custom work done, which was how Clara ended up with her first commission. A bridesmaid's dress in a deep rose that she spent 2 weeks on and finished and stood back from and thought, yes, that is the kind of work. That is what this is for. She had finished the navy dress in February. It had taken her 4 evenings, working slowly. The same careful attention Vera had given the bodice and the lining. She had called Patsy Dill's number on a Tuesday morning, and a woman had answered who sounded surprised and then quiet and then surprised again. And Clara had explained who she was and that the dress was finished and ready. Patsy Dill had driven in the following Saturday. She was 61 years old, small, with gray-streaked hair she wore pinned up, and she had stood in the shop doorway looking at the dress on the form for a long moment before she came in. She tried it on in the fitting area Clara had curtained off in the corner. She came out and stood in front of the painted mirror, and she wept, briefly, the way people weep when something they had stopped expecting arrives anyway. She did not explain what the dress was for. Clara did not ask. She paid what Vera had quoted in 2019, exact, in cash, and left with the dress in a garment bag, and Clara stood in the doorway and watched her drive away. Loretta had been standing in the hardware doorway watching. She called across. "You finished it," Clara said. "Vera started it." Loretta nodded, the way she nodded at things that confirmed something she had already known, and went back inside. Dennis Caulfield stopped in on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, the redbuds finally out along the ridge, the light coming through the front window at the angle that meant the cold was gone for good. He did not mention the development project. He looked at the thread wall. He looked at the singer. He looked at the sign in the window, lit from inside, and she saw him read it and look away. He bought a spool of navy thread, the third darkest shade on the wall, which he almost certainly did not need. He paid for it with exact change from his coat pocket. Before he left, he placed an envelope on the counter. He said, "For the Harlan County Historical Archive, in Vera's name." He did not explain further. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at the shop, at the thread wall, at the singer, at the dress form in the window. And his expression was the expression of a man revising something. He said, "I'm going to build something in this county. I want it to be worth building." Clara said, "Then build it that way." He left. She heard his truck start and pull away, unhurried. She put the envelope in her notebook and went back to the machine. The woman from Pike County came in on the last Friday of April. She had driven an hour and heard about the shop from her neighbor who had heard about it from someone in Harlan, and she was carrying her mother's wedding dress in a white garment bag. Careful with it the way you are careful with something that has survived longer than it was expected to. She unzipped the bag and laid the dress across the counter, and Clara examined it. 1960s construction, a Duchess satin that had held its weight across 60 years. The seams still sound. The lace overlay intact except for a section along the left sleeve that had come away from its underlining. The waist would need to come in 2 inches. The hem would need to be taken up 4 inches for the daughter. The wedding was in June. Clara said she could have it in 4 weeks. The woman asked how much. Clara told her. The woman counted out bills, and Clara wrote a receipt in Vera's receipt book, filling in the next blank line after Vera's last entry. The handwriting different, but the format the same. Name, date, job, amount, balance due. She handed the carbon copy across the counter. The woman folded it and put it in her purse. She picked up her empty garment bag and turned to go. At the door she stopped and looked at the shop, at the thread wall, at the singer, at picture in the back with his work light on, at the tomato pincushion on the workbench beside the Maxwell House tin. She said, "I'm glad someone's here." Clara said, "So am I." The woman left. The bell above the door rang once and went quiet. Clara stood at the counter for a moment. She looked at the receipt book, at the woman's name written in the next blank line after 45 years of Vera's entries, her own handwriting beside Vera's, the way one season comes after another. Different, continuous. She went to the shelf above the workbench and took down the wooden box. She opened it. She lifted out the green ledger and carried it to the workbench and set it under the daylight lamp. She turned to the page after Vera's last entry. March 14, 2019. A coat lining for a woman named Grace Tipton. No charge. Reason noted. Grace is on the fixed income now, and the coat has 2 more winters in it if the lining holds. The page after that was blank. Clara picked up her red pen. She wrote the date, the last Friday of April, the year the redbuds came early. The year she drove 11 hours with everything she owned and parked in front of a shuttered shop on a dying Main Street and did not yet know what she was walking into. She wrote the woman's name from Pike County. She wrote what the dress needed and what she would charge, and 1 line of her own, in the particular plain language of the ledger. Mother's wedding dress, 1960s. Daughter's wedding, June. Waist in 2 inches, hem up 4. Lace overlay repaired. Good bones. Will last. She set the pen down. She set the tomato pincushion on top of the open ledger, the worn velvet warm under her palm, the small strawberry emery swinging gently. She turned off the overhead light and left the daylight lamp on above the workbench, and went to the front window and looked out at Main Street in the late April evening. The redbud at the corner throwing its pink against the last of the light. The 6 storefronts still dark, but somehow less permanent now, as if darkness were a condition and not a conclusion. She went upstairs. The percolator was on. Behind her, the sign in the window stayed lit. The dress form stood empty beside it, visible from the street, and for the first time in 5 years the light inside was on.